The book is actually the result of 25 years of research and investigation on my part. It actually started out when I was at TRU with the realization, or if you will, the comprehension, that what we teach in economics is absolute nonsense. We should not be teaching it. It's totally dangerous as a discipline. It has no basis, in fact, it has no basis in any scientific approach. There is no empirical evidence at all that supports economics. So with that in mind, I spent 20 years studying the field, looking at stuff. During that period, I examined something in the order of 2,000 documents, 2,000 different sources of information, and boiled it down to about 500 that I used in a book that I published called Markenomics, which is now on sale. Markenomics was kind of an academic book, kind of dry stuff. So I wanted to write a book that would more succinctly describe the results of bad economics. I wanted to develop something that showed all of the pitfalls that we experience in the world by relying on this particular discipline for producing policies and generating economic activity. And for 5 years, I went through my files. For 5 years, I went through another 1,000 references and many, many hours trying to boil things down. And I discovered something shocking. It absolutely blew my mind. The system had changed in the last 40 years to such an extent that literally millions of people are now suffering in the United States of America and around the world. They are suffering because money has been drained out of the system to the top. There are in the United States of America almost 2.5 million kids that sleep on the streets each year. 2.5 million children sleeping in cars or in doorways or actually in the streets themselves for no real reason. And on top of that, what really was astounding was finding out that there was no such thing as homelessness in the 1960s. The social scientists were determined that homelessness would disappear in the 1960s, would disappear. In the 1990s, following Reaganomics, homelessness increased dramatically and included 67,000 veterans from the American War who sleep on the streets because they have no place to go. We found that the whole process of hunger in America is huge. The United States of America has 20% of its children unable to satisfy themselves with food, going hungry, simply because their families do not have enough money to purchase food to feed them. And as a consequence, we had to put in place all kinds of food banks, food stamp programs to save these people. In the 1960s, there were no food banks. There were no food steps in the 1960s going up into the 1980s. None at all. People were able to feed themselves back in those days. Drug addiction. Back in the 60s, going into the 1970s, we laughed at the idea of drugs because we always pictured in our minds the hippie smoking away on his weed, okay, or taking a little shot of LSD or something. You know, that was our drug problem back in the 1960s, 1970s. Today, hundreds of thousands of people are dying from drug overdoses because of their families and the background in their families where poverty is a problem. And of course, in the United States, 54 million people do not have adequate coverage. It was a shock to realize back then, in the happy days of the 60s and the 70s, life was good. My father had 7 children. My father was a low-income earner. He was able to buy a house, a small house, an older house, but we had a house that we could live in. You can't do that today. It is impossible. So what happened was that the income pyramid, if you will, has suddenly changed dramatically. At one time, there was 61% of the Americans were in the middle class. That has fallen to 40-odd%. And the people in the middle class have dropped down into the lower income group, and the people in the lower income group have fallen off into homelessness, hunger, and unhappiness. You think about that. It's happened very quietly and surreptitiously, very quietly. And people don't know what's happening. They don't know why they no longer have a decent life. And they don't know who to blame. And so when we see a person like Trump come along and say to the people, I can save you, it doesn't matter that this guy is an absolute crook. He's promising to shake up the system, and that's enough for 80 million Americans who want to see things change. Who did it? Less than 900 people did it. Less than 900 people in the financial system and in the political system changed the dynamics of economics in the United States of America and around the world. Half of them are people in the financial community and in the corporate community. They've made changes. They've said, let's change the economic system. Let's not share the wealth anymore with people and employees and communities and with our government by paying our fair share of the taxes. Let's take that away. And let's have a system whereby we can take more money for ourselves, and as a consequence, the Rand Institute estimates that these people have removed over $50 trillion out of the American economy in the last 40 years. Today, we reckon it's $55 trillion taken out of the American economy, pushed up to the top. And I'm going to show you where it went in a minute or two. How did they do it? Very simple. They don't pay their people. The median wage in the United States of America and Canada has remained the same since 1980. The median wage, the ability to buy goods and services, has remained constant for the last 40 years. And on top of that, by not paying their employees, now we can redirect it to our shareholders, they said we need more money, so we need tax cuts. So they got their associates in the political system to change the laws a little bit with regards to taxation and loopholes and deductions and other things. And as a consequence of that, they were able to take more money out of the system. Now, when the government doesn't have enough money to pay for things, where do they go to get the revenue? Hello, Mr. and Mrs. America. We are now calling on you to, we've had increases. In Canada, we've got the GST, we've got the PST that has come along, and every place you turn, there are more taxes being imposed on us. Why? Because the wealthy no longer have to pay anything. And it's not the 1%, guys. It's not the 1%. A large part of the 1% are small business people. A large part of the 1% are professional people. A large part of the 1% are ordinary people like you and I who have good incomes because we're fortunate enough to have good jobs. It's the 0.1%, and even less than that, who have garnered all of the funds. Here's how they did it. At one time, this is an example, and the example is United Airlines. United Airlines, back in the 1960s, gave 46% of its budget to its employees. 46% of the budget went to employees in the company. Today, it's 20%. Doesn't show here, but it's 20%. Back in the old days, they paid 16% of their budget to government. Today, it's 8% goes to the government. Now, their shareholders were not receiving that much. Back in those days, they received 7%. Today, shareholders receive 38% of the money from the corporation. Now, here's what they did with it. Half of it went to the stock market. $11 trillion of it went to puff up the value of shares. Okay, they had all this money and they wanted to invest it in something, so they went to the stock market. And the stock market, they started to play with it. It became a gambling casino because they were no longer investing in the future, they were rather investing in the play of money going up and down. And as a consequence, they puffed shares up. Back in the 1980s, the price-earnings ratio for shares was 10 and 12 to 1. Today it's 26 to 1, price-earnings ratio. The shares have been puffed up. But that still wasn't enough. There wasn't enough play in terms of the numbers of shares that they could invest in. So they changed the laws with their partners, the government people, and in the United States it's the Republican Party who have aided this. The Republican Party have assisted in this. The Republican Party have drained the wealth from the American system. And they developed derivatives. Do you know what a derivative is? Do you know what a derivative is? Warren Buffett called it an investment of self-destruction. It's a bet. It's a piece of paper that says, I bet you that currency value will increase by 2% in the next 30 days. And people take the bet. They invest in the derivative that's associated with the bet. And if it changes or it doesn't change. And so all of the fund managers and all the people are having a wonderful time betting. They have turned Wall Street into a gambling casino. Back in the old days, Wall Street would generate 1 to 2 new companies a day that they would invest in finance. Today, it's not even a quarter of that amount. It's less than a quarter of an amount. The other part of the money went to the executives. $5 trillion went to the executives. Back in the 1960s, the 1970s, the ratio between the pay of a CEO and the fellow working in his plant and the lady working in his office was 30 to 1. So if the folks in the plant were making $10 an hour, the executive was making $300 an hour. That's the way it was back in those days. You know what it is today? You know what it is today? 300 to 1,000 to 1. The president of Alphabet last year had a wage or an income of $228 million. The president of the investment banking community averages $40 to $50 million in income a year for just being a CEO. A CEO is not a big deal. President of the United States of America makes $400,000 a year. Can you see any justification other than that? And finally, of course, $22 trillion they didn't know what to do with. It's in offshore bank accounts where they've hidden it. They use as justification for all of this the rules of economics. The justification to change the laws, the justification to move money to the wealthy is predicated on 3 concepts that were pushed and developed by a fellow by the name of Milton Friedman. Friedman said, give money to the wealthy and they will invest it and they will create jobs. And we will all be wealthy and happy and comfortable. Doesn't work that way. Trickle down has never worked, never will work, and has been used only as an excuse to direct money to the people at top. The second thing they say is let the free market reign. Let the laws of supply and demand work. They don't. People don't buy things on the basis of supply and demand. You buy things on the basis of need. Do I need it? And how much am I willing to pay for it? And how badly do I need it? And the trade-off is there. Not whether some stupid line says you're going to buy less or buy more because you want to increase your maximization of your utility. Bulldog. Nonsense. It's never worked. And finally, Milton Friedman said, the only purpose for a corporation is to make money. That's all. And so, only the dollar counts. Only money counts in terms of running a corporation. We now know that to be garbage. So how do we return to sanity? Well, I don't have time to go through all of this, but clearly, taxation has to increase. Clearly, taxation has to go back to what it used to be. Do you know that in the 1960s and the 1970s, the rich were taxed at the margin, at the high end of the margin, at 80%? 80%? If you were making $10 or $12 million a year, your next $1 million was taxed at the rate of 80%. Corporations paid 50% straight across the board. There weren't all these tax holds and reductions and so forth. They paid their fair share. And why not? People are getting rich because the system supports them, and they have to pay for the system that made them rich in the first place. And that's what we have to do. And finally, of course, we have to get rid of this nonsense called economics. Now, if we don't, there will be a revolution in the United States of America, and perhaps in Canada. Because While I've addressed most of my attention to the American system, the spillover here is the same. We are held back here. The Rand Institute makes the observation that if we were paid consistent with the way we were paid back in the 60s and 70s, you'd be making twice the money you're making today. Twice the money you're making today. None of it would have gone to the rich, who don't need it. And so, unless we change, unless we do a number of things, we will have a disruption, if not a termination, of our way of life.